Hi, everybody. I'm super excited to be here to talk to you about the Twitter API v2 and how students and educators can benefit from it. My name is Suhaim Parak, and I'm a developer advocate for academic research at Twitter. So developer advocate is basically somebody who helps other developers succeed in using APIs and using different software. So I particularly focus on the academic research space, which means that I help students, professors, understand how to use the Twitter API for research purposes, what kind of data you get from Twitter, how you can use that data for your research, how can you build data pipelines and things like that. My Twitter handle is Suhaim Parak. So if you ever have questions about the Twitter API, feel free to reach out to me on Twitter. For the agenda, we'll first be talking about what the Twitter API is, and then we'll get into the specifics of what kind of data the Twitter API provides. Because a lot of times students have questions where they're like, "Hey, I'm not really sure what kind of data Twitter provides through its API in order for them to inspire good use cases." So we're going to talk about what data the Twitter API provides. Then we'll talk about, or we'll take a look at few sample apps that are built with the Twitter API. Then we'll get into the specifics of what or how students can use the Twitter API for their research, and also how educators can actually incorporate the Twitter API in their classroom for various purposes. And then towards the end, we look at a demo for how to actually use the Twitter APIs in Postman, and also how to connect in code. And then finally, we'll get into resources and Q&A at the end. So jumping right into this, firstly, let's understand what the Twitter API is, right? So the Twitter API is actually a programmatic way for interacting with Twitter and getting Twitter data in a programmatic fashion, right? Even a step before this, an example that professors always give to students around the use of or the term API is they give the example of going to a restaurant, right? So if you wanted to, let's say, go out and let's say eat a burger, you go to a restaurant, but you don't just go into their kitchen and start making the burger yourself, right? Instead, in fact, in most cases, you won't even have access to their kitchen, right? Instead, what you'll do is you'll have an interface with a server. So a server comes to you, presents to you a menu. You decide, okay, this is what I want to order, and then it's up to the server to go into their kitchen and get the food cooked for you and get it to your table, right? So there's the same analogy that is used for APIs, is that in many cases, or in most cases, you actually don't even have access to, let's say, a data store or a database, but instead you interface with the API, and the API then you specify what kind of data you want, and the API interfaces with your database and brings the data for you, right? So similarly, let's say somebody is tweeting live on Twitter right now. Let's say you use the hashtag Postman Summit, Student Summit. All of these are now tweets on Twitter, right? Now, if you want to get these programmatically, you need to connect with the Twitter API and specify that I'm looking for tweets that are specifically about the hashtag Postman Student Summit and so on. And then the Twitter API gets you the data for this search term, right? So the way that we've structured our Twitter API is we have various endpoints, right? So when we say endpoints, we basically mean different functionality that's available on the Twitter API. So for example, one use case is around historical data, right? Let's say you're a researcher, you're a student who wants to get data about a certain a hashtag, a certain keyword, a certain topic from somebody's account, things like that. You can go back in time. So let's say there are two different options. If you see, there's one recent search where you can get the last 7 days worth of Twitter data, or this full archive search, which is available to researchers who can get data from the full archive of public tweets, right? So anything that's ever been tweeted that's publicly available. So you can think about things like the initial conversation around the corona pandemic, the Hurricane Harvey, anything that's happened in the past, then researchers can then go back in time and specify certain search terms that I want tweets about a certain topic. I wanted to include retweets. I wanted to include images, not include images. All of those things fall under this category of historical APIs. Next category is real-time APIs. So real-time is for breaking events, right? So let's say some important event is happening on Twitter. As people are tweeting, those tweets are available in real time using this real-time endpoint. So we have two. One is the sample stream, which gives us a 1% sample of all the tweets on Twitter. And then filtered stream is what gives you filtering by topic. So you can actually set filters that as people are tweeting about the hashtag Postman Student Summit, I want those tweets streamed to me so that maybe you want to display it in a UI. You want to send notifications based on those. All of those use cases are supported with the real-time endpoints. Then we have the functionality to look up, meaning you can specify tweet ID and you can get the data about the tweet, or you can actually look up the entire timelines of users, right? So this is mostly used for cases where somebody is building a UI. So let's say they want to bring all of my tweets in like a UI form, then they'll go and get my entire timeline and they'll then display it. So these are some of the endpoints or some of the functionality that's available on the Twitter API. Obviously, we're going to get into the demos and things like that for each of these, but this a high level explanation. But let's look at what the data looks like, right? Because when somebody says, "Hey, I'm getting Twitter data," what does it mean to get Twitter data, right? It means that you've applied for a Twitter developer account. Your developer account was approved. You were able to create a app in the developer portal, and then you get a specific bearer token, which we know that the requests that you're going to make to the Twitter API are coming from somebody who we approve to have a developer account. And so once you have that bearer token, you make different API calls, and we'll get into those. But this is an example of what that data looks like, right? So if in the bottom you see ID and text, so by default, you only get the ID and text for, let's say, a search term or a user's timeline of tweets, right? And then you also get additional information. Which language is that tweet in? What's the contextual information about that tweet? Who is the user who was tweeting it? What's their profile handle? And all of those things you can actually get back in a JSON. And then you can consume this JSON, whether you consume it in code or in tools like Postman, which I really love. And then you can start to understand and make sense of the data that you're getting back, right? So this is just one example of what the response from the Twitter API will look like, right? Now, one specific thing before we get into our first demo is this idea of context annotations that you see at the top. So context annotations provide contextual information about a tweet, right? Let's take an example here. In this tweet, we're saying Tigers will be back in San Francisco playing against the Giants, right? Now, the Tigers is referring to the Detroit Tigers team. The Giants referring to the San Francisco Giants team, right? But notice that even though the word San Francisco Giants or Detroit Tigers aren't mentioned, it's contextually apparent that the tweet is about the Tigers and the Giants. And so in this case, what happens is Twitter does like first party named entity recognition and topic modeling for you. By that, I mean they contextually identify what this tweet is about, and then they label it as such. That's why in the previous tweet, we saw that in your response, you get this domain and entity, which basically corresponds to these two things. That the domain was that this is a sports team, and the entity that Detroit Tigers. So you can have context annotations around people. So if it's a politician, if it's a TV personality, if it's an athlete, and a bunch of other categories. And this helps you contextually understand what the tweet is about, because otherwise you would use third-party services like AWS or some of the other ones that are available that do the topic modeling and named entity recognition for you. But in this case, Twitter provides this directly from in the API. So let's look at an example of a usage of this context annotation. So if we can have our first demo up. Let's look at a demo app that uses the Twitter API v2. It's called the Timeline Explorer, which gives you the common topics an account tweets about based on the recent 3,200 tweets from that user's timeline. The way that it works is that you specify a username and click Explore Timeline. The app will then call the Twitter API's user tweet timeline endpoint, and it will get the count of the most common tweet annotations from a user's timeline. Now, tweet annotations provide contextual information about a tweet. So for example, if a tweet contains the word Ravens, and if it is contextually about the Baltimore Ravens football team, then the tweet will be annotated as such. For this example, I will put my own username and click Explore Timeline. As you can see in the response, some of the common topics based on my tweets are Twitter, computer programming, etc. Let's try another example and use the ESPN handle this time. you can see that the common topics that this account tweets about include basketball, NBA, etc. So you can see that's just one example sample app that we put together to really showcase the value of tweet annotations and what you can use it for. So let's get into how students can actually use the Twitter API, right? Because Twitter API is actually one of the popular APIs that is used by students for various use cases. The first one is to learn how to code, right? When students are first getting started with like a class that introduces them to API, one of the APIs that they generally tend to use is the Twitter API to learn things like what an HTTP request is, what status code, for example, 200 means, 404 means, what's a authorization header, all of these concepts to learn how to code and how to consume APIs in your code, like how to use third-party libraries and things like that. Those are use cases that students use the Twitter API for. Similarly, for building bots. So if you want to build a bot on Twitter, so there's an example of a bot is the Snowbot, which gives you the weather report for a place. So if you ask, hey, what's the weather like in Whistler or in Boulder and things like that, because you want to go skiing, it'll actually give you the weather report for that place. So bots are an example. Next is building crisis management apps, and this is actually something that we're going to get into in the next slide. But a lot of students have built apps for like emergency situations that actually help people in case of emergency situations. Then obviously the last use case is around improving the conversation on Twitter. So people build apps or like integrations that essentially allow an improved experience on Twitter. So whether it's like around analytics, whether it's around reducing toxicity in conversations and things like that, like the Block Party app does. Those are some examples. So let's take one specific example of what students recently built, right? So this is a screenshot of like the situation in India where there was unfortunately a second wave of COVID. And what happened is people were taking to Twitter to say, hey, I need oxygen, or I need an ICU bed, I need remdesivir, things like that. And so there were like a lot of these tweets, and then there were volunteers on ground who wanted to like help some of these people making the request, right? So students actually built various apps to support this using the Twitter API, right? So this is one of those examples. This was an app that essentially lets people filter by cities. So they'll say, okay, in Mumbai, who's requesting, for example, oxygen, or who's requesting ICU admission, things like that. And then there would be volunteers on the ground who would then contact. So they would call, this app would then call the Twitter API, and the Twitter API would give them the tweets based that meet these criteria. And then they would take those tweets back and display it in a UI. And then those volunteers on the ground would then call them up and help them. So the reason why I'm including this example here is to showcase that these are actually built by students to support these like emergency situations in India. Next, let's look at the academic research product track, right? So within the Twitter API, researchers, by researchers, we mean like master students, PhD students, postdocs, and professors at universities can actually get elevations on the Twitter API. What I mean by elevations is that firstly, they'll get access to the full archive of public tweets. So from the very first tweet ever up until now, anything that's publicly available, researchers get access to that, so they can go back in time to study. Like I said, for example, if somebody's like, hey, I want to study the initial conversation around Corona pandemic, let's say in 2020, early 2020, they can go back in time. They can specify that, give me tweets about COVID-19 for this time period, and then get the entire, which is like millions and millions of tweets that they can then use to study for their research, right? So that's what academics get as part of this academic product track. They get higher levels of access, meaning they get 10 million tweets per month. They're able to filter specifically for certain, like, give me all geotag tweets and things like that. So they have more precise filtering capabilities, and they get like a new application flow as well, right? So the application flow for researchers is in addition to the developer portal. So first, you've applied for your developer account, and once you've applied for a developer account, you need to, if you're an academic, then you'll fill out a next form, which will basically ask you your affiliation with your university and things like that, and why you, or like what kind of research you're planning to do. And once approved, then you'll have access to this academic product track that you can then use to do your research on Twitter. So a few examples of how educators are using the Twitter API, right? So one is obviously to increase API literacy. Many professors want to make sure that their students are ready for industry skills, meaning they know how to connect with APIs, get data, store that data, and all of those things. So many people, many professors are actually using the Twitter API for that, to teach in a classroom kind of setup. And by teaching, they're also using it in like specific courses around like social networks, computational social science courses, analytic courses, and things like that. So you can think of courses around text mining and things like that, where professors will use Twitter API as an example of like showing how to get data, how to clean data, how do you build, how to do exploratory analysis, how do you build models and things like that. And then obviously the key use case that this product track unlocks is research. So if there's like a lab at a university that's doing research with Twitter data, then they'll use Twitter. They can use this academic product track to get data for the research. So what are some examples of the research that is done with Twitter data? Obviously, this is not an exhaustive list, but this is just to give few ideas around what researchers use the Twitter API to study, right? So one key area is misinformation. So researchers will study how misinformation spreads in social networks, how what can be models to reduce misinformation and address challenges around the spread of misinformation, things like that. That's one thing that researchers study. Similarly, the coronavirus pandemic, a lot of researchers in the past year and a half have actually studied various things around the coronavirus pandemic on Twitter. Similarly, people study hate speech and polarization and how those can be reduced on, like how to reduce toxic conversations on Twitter and things like that. And then obviously another example is the 2020 US elections. That was also studied by researchers. So these are hopefully some areas, gives you a good sense of what kind of research is possible with the Twitter API. Now let's actually get into the Twitter API and how you can use it in Postman, because Twitter actually has a Postman collection that you can directly import in your Postman locally and start using the API. And obviously, Postman does an excellent job of making it easy for you to go from making your first API call and then building on top of that. So let's take a look at our demo first. In this demo, let's look at how to get started with the Twitter API v2 using Postman. In order to start using the Twitter API, you need a valid Twitter developer account. To apply for access, visit developer.twitter.com. In order to connect to the Twitter API, you first need to go to your Twitter developer account and create a project. Give your project a name. Next, select your use case. And finally, provide a description for your project. Then you can create a new app which will give you your bearer token that you can use to connect to the Twitter API v2 using Postman. In order to use the Twitter API Postman collection, visit developer.twitter.com and go to Docs, then click Get Started. In the Twitter API section, click Get Started. Click on the Twitter API v2 and scroll down to the section that says Postman. Make sure you have Postman installed and click on Run in Postman at the top. Next, click on Postman for Mac if you use a Mac and open Postman on your machine. Next, select the workspace you want to use and click on Import. At this point, you will have the Twitter API Postman collection imported. In order to connect to the Twitter API, you will need your Twitter bearer token from the previous step. Click on Variables and paste your bearer token in the current value column for bearer token and click Save. Now let's start by looking at how you can search for tweets using the Twitter API. From your Postman collection, click on the Twitter API v2 and go to Search Tweets folder and click on Recent Search. Now let's say you want all tweets from the account Suhaim Parak. For the query parameter, type the value from Suhaim Parak, which is my Twitter handle, and click Send. This will give you 10 recent tweets and retweets from me for the last 7 days. If you want more than 10 tweets, then select max results parameter and type 100, which is the maximum number of tweets you can get using recent search endpoint. Now, if you want to filter out retweets and only get my original tweets, then you can exclude those using the hyphen followed by the is retweet in your query. In addition to tweet ID and text, if you also want to get the author ID and context annotation for the tweets, you can specify those using tweet fields parameter and by using author ID and context annotations as values. If you also want the user information for these tweets, you can use the expansions parameter and specify the value as author ID. In your response, you will see the users under the includes object. By default, you get the user ID, name, and username. If you want additional fields, such as profile image URL, you can specify those using the user fields parameter. Let's look at recent tweets about the Olympics. If you notice, you get the 100 most recent tweets. What if you need more than 100 tweets? You can use the next token value from the response and pass it in your request as a query parameter. This will give you the next 100 tweets. If you need more, use the next token value in your request until you have the desired number of tweets. Next, let's say instead of the tweets, you want the count of tweets for a search term for the last 7 days. You can use the recent tweet counts endpoint for this. Similar to the recent search endpoint, let's specify the query as Olympics, and this will give us the tweet counts per hour for the last 7 days by default. If you want the data aggregated by day instead, you can specify this using the granularity parameter and set it to day. This will give you the daily count for the term Olympics for the last 7 days. Finally, as the last example, let's say you want to get tweet information from a tweet ID. You can use the tweet lookup endpoint for this. Specify the tweet ID in the path parameter and you will get the tweet ID and text for this tweet. If you need additional tweet fields, you can specify those using the tweet fields parameter. And if you need the user information, you can specify that using the author ID expansion. Okay, so I hope that gives a good explanation of how you can get started with the Twitter API v2 in Postman and then explore the different options that you have in terms of searching for tweets, in terms of getting the user tweet timelines, counts, and so on, right? Before we get into our last demo, I do want to mention how to connect with the Twitter API in code, right? Because we saw in Postman, so in Postman, you're actually making raw HTTP calls and getting the JSON response, right? But let's say you want to build an app, in Python, JavaScript, or something like that. You can actually use what are called libraries and packages. So libraries and packages basically take care of making these API calls for you, and they mask the response requests and so on. So it gives you just functions, and you use those functions and say, give me recent tweets. So something dot recent tweets and things like that, and they'll give you the desired data back. So let's look at an application of how would you write code to connect to the Twitter API. And in this case, we look at how to get visualizations for tweet counts, meaning to see how the tweets are trending over a time period. In this demo, let's look at how you can consume data from the Twitter API using a library in Python. We will learn how to build visualizations for the number of tweets per day for a topic. First, make sure you have Plotly, which is a library for building visualizations, and Twark, which is a library to connect to the Twitter API v2 installed. First, we will import the graph object from Plotly and the Twerk2 class from the Twerk package. Then, we will initialize the client to connect to the Twitter API by passing it our bearer token. Next, we specify a query, which is Olympics in this case. We will use the counts_recent method from the Twerk library and pass it the query and set the granularity to day, and then store the result in search results. The Twerk package gives you results in pages, but the first page consists of all tweet counts. So we add the response to the data and break. The data dictionary consists of the last 7 days and the corresponding tweet volumes for those days. We will add the date value to the day list and the count of tweets to the tweet counts list. Next, we will create a new figure using the Plotly package and specify that we want a bar chart using go.bar and assign the date to the x-axis and the tweet counts to the y-axis. Then we do fig.show to render our bar chart. You can see here the volume of tweets by day for the last 7 days about the search term Olympics. Okay, perfect. So before we get into Q&A, I do want to take a few minutes just to go over some resources that can help you get started now that you know what you can do with the Twitter API and what are the use cases that it unlocks. So the first is our documentation link, developer.twitter.com. If you go to, that's the link that you can always use to get to our documentation to understand how to apply for access, what endpoints are available, what an API, or like look at our different API references. Next is the twittercommunity.com. So twittercommunity.com is actually a place for you to ask questions about the Twitter API. So if you're getting started as a student and you got stuck, you have questions, you can always ask in our Twitter community forums, and you'll generally see there are a lot of people that'll be willing to help you and answer questions. And then two additional things. Obviously, one is the developer application, developer.twitter.com/en/apply. And then finally, we actually have a course available for students and researchers on our GitHub. So if you go to github.com/twitterdev, you'll see there's a getting started with the Twitter API v2 for academic research course. And this actually takes students from not knowing about like the Twitter API all the way to getting data in Python and in R. So definitely check out our course on GitHub. So it's on github/twitterdev. So twitterdev is our repository. And within that, you'll find this course. Definitely feel free to share that course with other students as well who might find it of value, or those who are just getting started with the Twitter API. So I'm going to pause there and we'll take questions.
Hi, Suhaim. That was fantastic. Thank you so much for giving very detailed demos all the way from how to play with it in Postman to actually putting it to code in Python. I'm feeling very inspired to like look up some Postman tweets. The chat has been blowing up and we have a couple questions for you. This is a good one. So is the Twitter API free to play with before applying for that academic research track?
Yep, so it is. There's what we call the standard product track, which has a lower tweet cap compared to the academic track that you can apply for when you apply to for access using developer.twitter.com. Once you get access to most of the endpoints so that you can get started quickly. In fact, the course that I pointed out to actually starts off with that standard product track, which anybody can use. And obviously, once you understand that the value and things like that, then if you're a researcher, then you can apply for access. And just want to clarify that the academic research product track is also free. It's just that it's limited for researchers who meet the criteria of being postdocs, PhDs, professors, and things like that.
Got it. So the non-academic research one has some limitations, but it's a great way to poke around the API and find out how to use it.
For sure. Yeah, that's like a perfect intro to the API. And then the academic product track has a lot more data and historical data and things like that.
Excellent. It sounds easy to get started. We also, because you've made it sound so easy to get started, some people are curious about how they might use the Twitter API to make an app. So this person asks, can I monetize an app which uses the Twitter API?
Yeah, so there are apps today that like have monetization in it. Like you may have seen a few, and I can't remember a few exact specific names, but yeah, there are actually a few apps that do provide, let's say, advanced analytics and things like that, and they have like a monetization built into those apps.
Excellent. Well, I think you did such a thorough job explaining everything in your presentation. I know we have a couple people looking forward to watching the recording demos again later. So I think you answered everybody's questions. That's all we got.
Awesome. It was nice getting the opportunity to introduce the API to students and educators.
Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.